Again, Ken Cousins, I'm with Earth Economics. We're a small nonprofit based in Tacoma, Washington. We'd like to acknowledge that we operate on the lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Puyallup tribe and the 1854 Medicine Creek Treaty. We typically focus on ecosystem service valuation. We've been doing that for about 20 years now. About 5 or 6 years ago, we started looking more seriously at ways to finance projects that would improve habitat quality or the restoration, these sorts of issues. And along those lines, started looking at things like Fema, where they make the availability of funding for a variety of projects that would be relevant to habitat restoration. Specifically, we're looking at salmon access. There's, as everyone's aware, there's the injunction that's recently been upheld by the Supreme Court, basically saying that Washington State's on the hook for restoring access to hundreds of miles of inland habitat throughout Puget Sound and the Olympic Peninsula. The initial estimates, I think, were around $2 billion to restore access throughout the injunction area, and that's actually gone up over time, not surprisingly. So this is a representation of the fish passages which are blocking access to inland habitat throughout the state. There are a considerable number of them on the injunction area. And so what we decided to do is see if we could leverage or access FEMA funding as a way to support replacement of these, what we've called failed culverts or non-compliant culverts. These are road stream crossings largely. And specifically, we're looking at hazard mitigation and what used to be called pre-disaster mitigation has since been renamed as the BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. This is a not inconsiderable source of funding nationally, again, within the United States. The $5.1 billion were dispersed last year for disaster-related or mitigation or remediation throughout the country. Not all of these, actually none of these, to our knowledge, had anything to do with salmon habitat, but that's our hope, is to be able to access some of that funding to support communities as they're trying to both improve public safety and improve access for salmon to inland habitat. So just to go over a little bit about hazard mitigation assistance, the goal here is to reduce or eliminate long-term risk. And there's FEMA in particular is focused on human life and property, tied to natural hazard events, of course. One of the stipulations for FEMA grants is that they must be cost effective, that you apply through, each state has a centralized state emergency management office. They have different names in different states. But essentially, they will hold a kind of a pre-contest for which ones they want to forward onto the federal government for consideration for funding. And as part of that, they have to comply with local hazard mitigation plans. So how do we get to salmon habitat restoration or access to salmon habitat through effects on human life and property? Again, so what we're trying to do is reframe reduced risk as a benefit. So when we've got roads that are limiting, a culvert is limiting stream flow that could produce localized flooding. So the benefit there of replacing those culverts would be reduced localized flooding. Similarly, for if it completely blocks stream flow, that introduces the possibility of washouts and transportation disruptions. And then, of course, the real concern here is when they block access, or our real concern here is when they block access to salmon to inland habitat for spawning. Now, you'll hear me sometimes refer to culverts as AOPs. I learned along the way that this is the term of art within the scientific community. Again, aquatic organism passages, not limited to salmon, but in this case, that's what we're talking We had done an initial proof of concept of this approach in the Matanuska-Susitna borough of south central Alaska. We found in that study that 41% of the non-compliant culverts met the one-to-one benefit cost ratio based on conventional costs alone, risks to property or human life. So it's there's a strong possibility that this sort of approach could leverage funding meant to improve public safety and property, but also would benefit salmon. So an important understanding here is, what do we mean by risk? There are really two components to risk. One is exposure, what is at risk, and then what is the likelihood of that event happening that would put what is being exposed at risk. So you look at observed failure rates. You can also look at patterns of severe precipitation that could include escalating, like 500-year events that are occurring every 5 years, or 100-year events that are occurring every 5 years. So it's not just observed failure rates, but you can project out, and FEMA allows for that, provided you've got good documentation. You can say, we anticipate that rainfall events are going to increase over time, and that would increase the probability of failure at a given site over time. You could also bring in engineering details about what the character of the roadbed is, what the culvert itself is made of, et cetera. Surface permeability, both ground and impervious surfaces, groundwater levels, et cetera. So as a second follow-up on this, and to try and actually apply for FEMA funding, we looked at the Chehalis Basin. Within that fish passage barrier inventory, which was the statewide map I showed earlier, there are over 50,000 road crossings statewide that are known to have some impingement on salmon access. When we look at the Chehalis Basin, there are over 7,900 that are located in the upper and lower basin of the Chehalis. Of these, 2,500 are owned by state, county, municipal, or tribal governments. These are the entities that are legally empowered to apply for FEMA funding. You can have private persons apply through a state, county, municipal, or tribal government for particular projects, but those are the entities that actually have standing to be able to submit the application. When we started looking at those 7,900 culverts, again, we restrict down to those that are owned by eligible entities, and then also matched the location of these road stream crossings against GIS data for streams and roadways. And we were able to identify 930 AOPs that fell outside of 500-year floodplains, but yet still blocked access to salmon habitat. So how did we do this? There were two kind of principal components or data components that we used to be able to kind of identify locations that were at risk from flooding or transportation disruptions. The biggest delimiter, and the one that probably is the hardest to come by, is LiDAR data. We needed high resolution LiDAR data to be able to estimate what the height of overtopping of a roadway would be if we assumed that the culvert was fully blocked. So in this case, where the yellow dot is, that's where our culvert is. We make the assumption that it's blocking access to water, and then we modeled the elevation of that roadway at that point until, and then mapped it upstream to show what area would be flooded if that, basically the road were turned into a levee rather than just a wall with a hole in it. And in this case, you can see several buildings that fall within that footprint. We estimate the damages to that using something FEMA calls a depth damage curve. That's basically how high would the water be relative to the first floor elevation of that building. And then they have a schedule that tells you what percentage of loss you can estimate for each day of flooding. The other component that we did on this was to look at road networks and to be able to do the same sort of thing, but instead of blocking stream flow, we blocked transportation flows. And because we were focused mostly on critical critical issues, we looked at with the location of first service or first responders, so hospitals, uh, fire stations, police stations, et cetera, and then mapped households. These were residential parcels spread throughout the upper and lower basin, and then basically turned off the culverts one by one. We had an automated script that did this and stepped through all 930 throughout the basin and basically calculated the additional distance that would be required, time and distance that would be required to access emergency services from any residential parcel throughout the basin if any of the culverts were shut off or washed out rather. From this, we determined that the 817, that's over 90% of the AOPs throughout the basin, had non-zero costs associated with them. These were a pretty wide range. We had one culvert in Lewis County that it was almost $2.7 million per day in damages for each day that a road was either washed out or flooded. I believe most of the damage in that particular case came from flooding rather than road network disruptions. Although some of these that were a little bit lower down in the basin ended up, there was quite a bit of traffic on some of these roads, and although the detours were relatively small, they still ended up adding up in terms of lost time it took to locate or get to emergency services. The average overall across all of our culverts was $13.8 thousand for each day a culvert fails. And this, again, is per day. So that increases the costs in terms of access to emergency services or to business opportunities. Those increase linearly with time, but flooding actually escalates. So the more time that a building is flooded, the more damage, it's a proportionally greater damage for the longer flooding persists at the local level. We found that this approach, and this is part of our goal from the beginning, was to expand stakeholder interest in the replacement of salmon blocking culverts. We considered, that if we're looking at property damage and human safety, we introduced property owners and local residents as stakeholders, people who have skin in the game on this, insurance companies, public safety advocates, and those that manage transportation either through policy or management. So when we're applying for FEMA funding, there are several components that have to be included. One is a project description. The next is the current level of risk, and that's characterized in dollars per year. A description or an explanation of how the proposed project will mitigate risk, a timeline, a benefit cost analysis, and if you are actually pursuing restoration activities beyond just restoring access, you can include the ecosystem services associated with that inland habitat that is now accessible by salmon. So, ecosystem services. You can think of these as economic assets. A general term that's applied towards ecosystems from an economics perspective is the idea of natural capital, as opposed to, say, financial capital or social capital. Ecosystem functions produce flows of benefits, which we call ecosystem goods and services. Unfortunately, many of those goods and services are not traded in markets, or they're not fully traded in markets, and therefore there's value that's not being recognized within the market system. And this is generally known within economics as an externality. They can be positive or negative. At Earth Economics, we typically will report these non-market benefits by ecosystem type in terms of dollars per acre per year. So for the last 5 years or so, we've been working actively with Fema to get them to integrate ecosystem services into their benefit cost analysis tool. And these are the current values. These are, I guess it's been 7 years ago now. These are the current values that you can apply, and it's just across the board. If you've got area that you're restoring or establishing green space, it's already $8,300. Relevant for salmon, it would be riparian or estuary area, possibly wetlands. The riparian area is the big dollar item. That's close to $40,000 per acre per year that you can apply. And again, when you submit these to FEMA, you end up running these out across the project lifetime, so that $40,000 benefit can add up considerably over time. So again, it's benefits over the project life. The FEMA tends to want to focus mostly on risks to health or risks to humans and risks to properties. They'll acknowledge the environmental benefits, but most of the time that's just the little bit that pushes you over the top in terms of the benefit cost ratio. It's not, unfortunately, it's not FEMA's central focus. There are a number of costs that get built into that, like how are you going to implement this restoration project, et cetera. The other thing about FEMA is that they require cost sharing of 25% of project costs. However, for economically disadvantaged communities in rural areas, that cost share can be reduced to only 10%. That's also something that we are working actively with FEMA to change the definition of that to make it more accessible, to kind of expand the understanding of what economically disadvantaged rural and communities mean. So limitations to the FEMA process and culvert replacement. One is that the applications do require extensive documentation. You basically have to have everything recorded and supported by hard data. There's a two-part review process. Again, there's one that happens at the State Emergency Management Agency and then another at the federal level. So it can take a considerable amount of time for funding to be dispersed. And of course, they're highly competitive. Not only do you have this kind of internal review at the state level and then again at the federal level, but you don't always have control over what the natural disaster du jour is. And if you have something very considerable happen in a given year, that can suck a lot of the air out of the room in terms of financing opportunities. This second part of the project, the one in the Chehalis Basin, was funded by the Harder Foundation. This was developed some years ago. We initially meant to present this at the Salish Sea Conference 2 or 3 years ago, and then COVID happened, so that's why some of this is a bit dated. But